The man known to history as Henry Tudor, King Henry VII of England, was born in Pembroke Castle in Western Wales on the 28th of January 1457. Henry's father was Edmund Tudor, 1st Earl of Richmond. He was the son of Catherine of Valois and Owen Tudor, who Catherine had married after her first husband, King Henry V, died back in 1422. This made Edmund Tudor, Henry's father, a half-brother to the reigning King of England, Henry VI. Henry's mother was Lady Margaret Beaufort, a descendant of John of Gaunt, the third son of King Edward III, who had ruled England between 1327 and 1377, and Catherine Swynford. Henry's early life was fraught with danger, as would be the first 3 decades of his life. 3 months before he was born, his father, Edmund Tudor, died of bubonic plague. After this, his mother, Margaret, who was only 13 years old at the time, sought refuge at Pembroke Castle with her brother-in-law, Jasper Tudor, who would become a surrogate father to his newborn nephew. Margaret, who was thin, short, and far too young to give birth, struggled so intensely throughout her labour that her attendants thought it likely that both she and her child would die. Henry survived, though, and Margaret recovered, although it is likely that childbirth at such an early age may have resulted in physical damage, as, despite being married twice more throughout her life, Margaret would have no more children, and her only child, Henry, became the centre of Margaret's world. She loved and defended him fiercely, nurturing great ambitions for his future. Margaret had been betrothed to Edmund Tudor at age 9, 3 years prior to her marriage at just 12 years of age. At the time of the betrothal, King Henry VI, the reigning monarch of England, had no heir, though a son, Edward of Westminster, would be born to him and his queen, Margaret of Anjou, in 1453. As the richest heiress in England, with an annual income of £1,000, Margaret was also of royal blood, being the great-granddaughter of John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, the third son of the last undisputed Plantagenet king, Edward III, whereas the rival House of York was formed of royal figures who were descended from the second and fourth sons of Edward III, illustrating why the early conflicts of the Wars of the Roses became known in some circles as the Cousins' War. This might have placed Henry in line to the throne at his birth, but Margaret Beaufort's family was descended from John of Gaunt's third marriage to Catherine Swynford, who had been the Duke's mistress for 25 years, and whose children had all been born before their marriage, making them of royal blood, but illegitimate. A royal decree issued decades earlier by King Henry IV has subsequently legitimized the Beaufort children, but had explicitly stated that neither they nor their ancestors could inherit the throne of England. The Yorkists consequently had a much better claim to the English throne should Henry VI be removed from power at some juncture, while Henry Tudor's claim was weak based on the illegitimacy of the descendants of John of Gaunt and Catherine Swynford. Nevertheless, the Tudors fared well under Henry VI, with the king and his government conferring titles on Edmund and Jasper Tudor, who were Henry VI's half-brothers on account of their being the sons of the Dowager Queen Catherine of Valois from her second marriage to Owen Tudor. Few specific details are known about Henry's childhood and education. As a member of the Royal House of Lancaster, he would have received a good education, one which was then beginning to evince traces of the humanistic curriculum that was being developed in Renaissance Italy, with its emphasis on grammar, rhetoric, arithmetic, history, languages, and geography. His guardianship and place of residence changed several times during his childhood and adolescence, often with little warning. The lifelong bond between Henry and his mother would remain strong, but sadly, they would be separated before Henry's first birthday. In the spring of 1457, Margaret remained with her baby and brother-in-law Jasper at Pembroke Castle, mourning her late husband who had died just months before Henry's birth. However, in order to protect him, she knew she must marry again. This would not be a difficult task for Margaret, a wealthy heiress. By April, the now 14-year-old Margaret Beaufort was betrothed to Henry Stafford, second son of the Duke of Buckingham and 15 years older than herself. They were married in January 1458. By all accounts, Margaret's second marriage was a happy one. Henry was left in the care of his uncle Jasper Tudor at Pembroke Castle. Not as harsh an action as it seems. All evidence indicates that Jasper adored his nephew, was highly active in his upbringing and education, and thought of him as a surrogate son. Moreover, both Margaret and Stafford visited Henry and Jasper at Pembroke Castle periodically. Like most other people in England at this time, Henry's life was intrinsically tied up in the changing fortunes in the Wars of the Roses. Each shift in power brought abrupt changes to his status, his security, and his daily life. King Henry VI had ascended the English and French thrones back in 1422 when he was 9 months old, owing to the premature death of his father, King Henry V. At that time, England was in a strong position, only a few years earlier having gained an immense victory over the French at the Battle of Agincourt as part of the 100 Years' War. But Henry VI's reign was marked by a dramatic decline in England's fortunes, Henry's regency creating infighting amongst the English nobles who vied for influence over the child king. To make matters worse, as Henry VI approached adulthood, he began suffering from periodic mental health issues, frequently lapsing into bouts of dementia-like confusion and sometimes near catatonic behavior. The king's precarious health and long periods of unresponsiveness resulted in a breakdown in governance and authority and allowed the opening of a power vacuum. Power now rested with those closest to this weakened king, and the Yorkists would grow resentful of what they viewed as the corrupt exploitation of Henry's vulnerable state by his Lancastrian ministers and advisers. They would also blame the steady losses of Henry V's gains in France on the Lancastrians and distrusted Henry's queen, Margaret of Anjou, a French woman whom they resented for taking an intensely active role in governance and military matters on her husband's behalf. Meanwhile, the Lancastrians actively worked to keep the Yorkists, their Plantagenet cousins, from reaching for the throne themselves. Tensions between those surrounding the king rose throughout the 1450s, breaking out into violent hostility by the spring of 1455, and over the next 5 years, hostilities would continue to escalate, leading to the Yorkists being accused of treason, leaving them with little choice but to fight to win the throne. The leader of the Yorkist faction, Richard, Duke of York, had declared his claim to the crown and commenced a civil war to press that claim from the mid-1450s onwards. When he died at the Battle of Wakefield on the 30th of December 1460, his eldest surviving son and heir, the 18-year-old Edward, took up his father's claim and his cause, ultimately winning a crushing victory against the Lancastrians at the Battle of Towton in North Yorkshire on the 20th of March 1461, which was one of the bloodiest conflicts ever to have taken place on English soil in terms of lives lost. Approximately 50,000 troops were engaged at the peak of the 12-hour battle, and upwards of 15,000 were killed or wounded. On the 28th of June 1461, Edward of York was crowned King Edward IV at Westminster Abbey, and Henry Tudor's life changed forever. The first years of the new king's reign saw him attempt to consolidate his rule by removing or disempowering other claimants to the English throne. Henry VI was captured by the new king, but his wife, Queen Margaret, fled to France with her young son Edward of Westminster, the Lancastrian Prince of Wales. Meanwhile, 4-year-old Henry Tudor was stripped of his estates and title, Earl of Richmond, which earldom King Edward IV then gave to his own brother, George, Duke of Clarence. Henry's uncle, Jasper, a loyal Lancastrian general whose life was now in danger, bid a brief and sad farewell to his nephew, fleeing into exile in France. Subsequently, King Edward IV granted both Jasper Tudor's earldom of Pembroke and the wardship of Henry Tudor to the Yorkist loyalist Sir William Herbert. Henry would remain at Pembroke with Herbert for the next 8 years, a virtual prisoner of the Yorkists. While Henry's position had changed substantially, he was likely too young to understand fully what was occurring. Edward IV had assigned him a Yorkist guardian in order to watch him, to ensure that he did not develop any ideas concerning his own claim to the throne, no matter how weak it might be. Although the boy was technically a prisoner, there is no evidence that Sir William Herbert mistreated Henry. Instead, he continued to live in the home he knew and continued to receive regular, though closely supervised, visits from his mother and stepfather. Henry's life changed abruptly once again in 1469 when Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, known as the Kingmaker for his role in engineering the rise of Edward IV to the throne, rebelled against the man he helped guide to the throne, now attempting to depose Edward and place his younger brother, George, Duke of Clarence, on the throne. Clarence himself had already begun attempting to clear his own path to the throne by reviving old rumours that the new king had been secretly married to another woman before his marriage to his queen, Elizabeth Woodville, making the union illegal and all of their children illegitimate. In the conflict that followed, Sir William Herbert fought for King Edward as a loyal Yorkist, but after their loss at the Battle of Edgecote Moor in July 1469, Herbert was captured by Warwick, denounced as an evil adviser to the king, and executed. With his guardian dead, the 12-year-old Henry sought refuge with his mother and stepfather at their estate at Woking. By 1470, it was clear that Warwick had failed to gain support to place the Duke of Clarence on the throne, and having gone too far to reconcile with Edward now, he instead threw in his lot with the Lancastrians, travelling to France and making a deal with Margaret of Anjou to place her husband, Henry VI, who was still imprisoned in the Tower of London, back on the throne. With this agreement in place, Warwick headed to England with support from France and quickly drove King Edward from London before liberating a confused Henry VI from the Tower. Around the same time, Jasper Tudor returned from exile and promptly brought his nephew Henry to court. An uneasy peace reigned for less than a year before Edward IV returned, defeated the forces of Warwick at the Battle of Barnet on the 14th of April 1471, and then defeated the combined forces of Margaret of Anjou and the Lancastrians at the Battle of Tewkesbury on the 4th of May. After this, he resumed the throne officially on the 21st of May. That very night, Henry VI was murdered in the Tower, most likely by a hard blow to the back of his head. Some historians believe that the murder, ordered by King Edward, was actually carried out by his younger brother Richard, later the reputedly ruthless Richard III. Whatever the circumstances, the reason for the act was clear. Edward was not willing to risk allowing Henry VI to become a focus of further conspiracies against his rule. What he must have only barely considered at the time was that in killing Henry VI, he was making the possibility of Henry Tudor being considered a claimant to the throne much more plausible. In the aftermath of the brief readeption of Henry VI and the swift restoration of Edward IV, most Lancastrians fled England, believing that Edward would now purge them if they remained in England. Fearful that Henry's life would be in danger, Margaret Beaufort made plans for her 14-year-old son to leave the country too. After the defeat at Tewkesbury, Jasper Tudor collected his nephew and the two boarded a ship at Tenby in Pembrokeshire, setting sail for Brittany in northwestern France and exile. They would remain in France for the next 14 years. Henry's mother did not join them there, though. Her third husband, Henry Stafford, had been killed at the Battle of Barnet, and 1 year later, in 1472, Margaret married again, this time to the Yorkist Lord Thomas Stanley. Some historians claim that this was a marriage of political expediency, that Margaret viewed the marriage as a way of staying safely close to the Yorkist court of King Edward IV and Queen Elizabeth Woodville. Through this arrangement, with Henry safely away in Brittany, she would be able to monitor the political situation in England and promote her son's cause there. In France, Henry and Jasper journeyed to the city of Nantes to seek asylum at the court of Francis II, Duke of Brittany. The Duke graciously received the two as his guests, and they accompanied the court on their progress to Vannes the following year. However, Duke Francis was in a difficult position, as he had given his word to shelter, protect, and provide for his guests, but two far more powerful men than he were also taking a keen interest in the fate of Henry and Jasper Tudor. From England, King Edward IV continually demanded that Francis extradite them back to England. Edward's goal was undoubtedly to eliminate the last living Lancastrian claimant to the throne now that Henry VI was dead, while his son, Edward of Westminster, had also been killed following Edward's victory at the Battle of Tewkesbury. Duke Francis also had to consider the wishes of King Louis XI of France, who was first cousin to Jasper and second cousin to Henry, who also wanted to keep the Tudors safe as potential bargaining chips with England if Edward was minded to recommence the 100 Years' War in France. Duke Francis therefore had to maintain a delicate balancing act, keeping both King Edward IV of England and King Louis XI of France at bay while protecting his two Tudor guests. Eventually, Francis took the decision to separate the pair, sending Jasper to the Château de Josselin in the heartland of Brittany and Henry to the Château La Goë, originally a military fortress in the town of Elven. For the first time in his life, Henry, now 17, was left alone and was far from home without any family members at all that he could see and consult with. For 3 lonely years, he was effectively under house arrest in the chateau's highest tower, even as Edward IV continued to press for Henry's extradition to England. In 1476, the English changed their tactics. Edward IV now bypassed Duke Francis and sent message directly to Henry inviting him to return to England and that his marriage to a Yorkist woman could be arranged. Edward may have been sincere in this offer and might even have had his own eldest daughter, Elizabeth of York, in mind as the prospective bride. The king further promised that if Henry returned now, he would inherit the vast Beaufort fortune and estates in the future, currently held by his mother Margaret. However, if Henry did not return, Edward IV declared he would receive nothing and his exile would be permanent. During the winter of 1476, Duke Francis, weakened by illness and swayed by councillors who thought it expedient to acquiesce to the demands of King Edward, finally capitulated and handed the now 19-year-old Henry over to English envoys. Edward's men escorted their prisoner to the port town of Saint-Malo, where their ship bound for England was docked and waiting. Henry's panic at that moment can only be imagined, but he showed his mental agility here. Thinking quickly, he feigned illness and then took sanctuary in a church there. Through these measures he managed to delay their departure for long enough for Duke Francis to have a change of heart and decide that Henry would remain in Brittany after all. There is little evidence to indicate where Henry was over the next 4 years, but by 1480 he was housed at the Château l'Hermine in Vannes, where he was finally reunited with his uncle Jasper after 6 years apart in France. Throughout the early 1480s, Edward IV continued to send offers of clemency to Henry and to arrange a marriage into the House of York if he would only surrender and return to England, but Henry and Jasper, ever suspicious of the king's intentions, refused all such proposals. On the 9th of April 1483, the obese Edward IV, whose health had been failing throughout the preceding year, died. He was survived by his widow, now the Dowager Queen of England, Elizabeth Woodville, and 7 children, 5 daughters, and, most importantly from the perspective of the succession, 2 sons. His eldest son, Edward, was promptly proclaimed as King Edward V, but there was disagreement within the House of York over whether the boy, who was just 12 years of age at the time of his father's death, was old enough to govern in his own name. His mother believed so, and the former king's councillors agreed that Edward should be crowned without delay. Yet the boy's uncle, King Edward IV's younger brother Richard, evidently saw it differently. As the last of Edward IV's brothers, Richard was now in a position of some authority during his nephew's rule as a child king. He quickly had himself named as Lord Protector until Edward V came of age. Within only a few days of their father's death, Richard had Edward V and his younger brother Richard of Shrewsbury detained and placed in the Tower of London, claiming that this was for their own safety and that there was a plot afoot to usurp Edward. In reality, the plotter was Richard himself, who now set about reviving the rumours that his brother's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville had been illegal and that Edward V and Richard of Shrewsbury were illegitimate. This done, on the 25th of June 1483, he had Parliament declare that his deceased brother's children were illegitimate and assumed the throne himself, being crowned 2 weeks later as King Richard III. The fate of his 2 nephews, known to posterity as the Princes in the Tower, remains a mystery. Richard almost certainly had them killed around the time he usurped the throne. Up until 1483, it seemed that the Wars of the Roses were finished and the Yorkist line had triumphed. Richard's actions changed matters, as many people, both supporters of the Yorkist and Lancastrian cause in years gone by, were disgusted by Richard's actions. Many former supporters of King Edward IV absconded to France and began contacting the 26-year-old exile Henry Tudor, still sheltering in Brittany, and his uncle Jasper. As tenuous as his claim to the throne was, Parliament, having decided nearly a century earlier that the Beaufort line would be legitimised only on the basis that members of it could not succeed to the throne of England, Henry Tudor was now the best hope for those who wished to get rid of Richard III. Over the next 2 years, disaffected Englishmen who were unhappy with Richard III's regime flocked to Brittany to join the growing Tudor cause. Meanwhile, back in England, as opposition to Richard's rule crystallised, over the disappearance and assumed murder of the princes in the Tower, Henry's mother, Margaret Beaufort, entered into secret negotiations with Elizabeth Woodville, the Queen Dowager, proposing that if she offered support to Henry's cause, he would subsequently marry Elizabeth and Edward IV's eldest daughter, also named Elizabeth, once he was King of England, in the process reconciling the various factions and bringing the Wars of the Roses to an end. Margaret was thus instrumental in organising the rebellion from England in secret and wrote to Henry in France about the negotiations for his marriage. These efforts by Margaret in 1483 also revolved around a planned rebellion by her in-law through her second marriage, Henry Stafford, 2nd Duke of Buckingham. In the late autumn of 1483, he revolted against Richard III, the plan being for Henry to cross from France with his supporters to join him. With ships, men and supplies loaned from the Duke of Brittany, Henry attempted to sail for England, but was prevented from doing so for several days by inclement weather conditions in the English Channel. Richard promptly crushed Buckingham's rebellion and had the Duke executed. Aware that Henry's mother had been involved, the king also confiscated her estates and income and placed her under house arrest. Richard also immediately demanded of the Duke of Brittany that he would extradite Henry Tudor back to England. In Brittany, Henry promptly headed for the court of King Louis XI of France, where he was warmly welcomed and provided with more men and financial support, the French being only too happy to sow unrest in England and potentially aid Henry Tudor to seize the English throne. Meanwhile, Margaret continued to write secretly to her son, keeping him informed of developments in England. Those who had survived Buckingham's failed rebellion had joined the growing numbers of supporters surrounding Henry in France, but although the cruelty of Richard III made him unpopular, that had not altered the fact that Henry Tudor's claim to the throne was tenuous at best, and that he was still a Lancastrian. Accordingly, many Yorkists supported him begrudgingly, and might not continue to do so for long after Richard's removal. Aware of these issues, on Christmas Day 1483, Henry addressed his varied supporters at Rennes Cathedral, swearing an oath to lead them to victory against Richard III and then to marry Elizabeth of York, as his mother and Elizabeth Woodville had planned. This move appeased the Yorkists and also added legitimacy to his potential seizure of the crown by ensuring that any children that Henry would have, and that might succeed him one day, would be the grandchildren of the deceased King Edward IV. This plan was soon nearly foiled. In England, after his queen Anne Neville died in March of 1485, rumours began to circulate at Richard III's court that he intended to marry Elizabeth himself, despite the fact that she was his niece. Such an action would prevent Henry from gaining legitimacy by marrying her. This development lent urgency to Henry's second attempt at an invasion of England and he finally set sail for England on the 1st of August 1485, accompanied by only a few thousand men. A small and not very unified force, Henry's army was comprised of Englishmen, Welshmen, and French mercenaries. They landed quietly in Wales, hoping to raise additional support locally before confronting Richard III's forces. They dropped anchor on the 7th of August at Mill Bay and struggled ashore near the town of Milford Haven in Henry's native Pembrokeshire, from which he had fled seemingly never to return 14 long years before. Henry, overcome with emotion, fell to his knees and kissed the soil beneath his feet, quoting the biblical Psalm 43, "Judge me, O Lord, and fight my cause." He then rose to his feet and cried out in a loud voice for his men to follow him in the name of God and St. George. Henry was able to raise additional military support in Wales in the 2 weeks that followed, marching over the English border with about 5,000 men. They met with Richard III's significantly larger force of between 10,000 and 15,000 at Bosworth Field in Leicestershire. Richard's army held the high ground on Ambion Hill, as well as, it seemed, all other advantages, including superior cavalry and reserves. However, the considerable forces of Lord Thomas Stanley, Henry's stepfather from his mother's 4th marriage, had not yet committed for either side, despite the fact that Richard was holding Stanley's son, Lord Strange, hostage to ensure Stanley's military support. Henry's infantry advanced first, under an intense exchange of fire. To reduce the damage of the barrage, they spaced themselves out across the field as they advanced. The vulnerability of these lines encouraged Richard's infantry to charge, at which point Henry's infantry reformed into a dense, wedge-shaped formation, against which Richard's attack collapsed. Richard then attempted to send in his reserves, the men of the Earl of Northumberland, Henry Percy. It is unclear why Percy's men failed to charge. Northumberland may have been waiting to see what Lord Stanley would do. It is also possible that he and his men may have been constrained from mobilization by the marshy ground, but Richard, it seems, had grown too impatient to wait any longer. He had sighted Henry at the rear of his army with a small cavalry contingent. Assembling a retinue of his household knights, Richard led a charge down the hill towards the bodyguard surrounding Henry Tudor. Richard charged boldly across the field on his horse. In the moments that followed, he killed Henry's standard-bearer and came within feet of Henry himself. The moment of Richard's attack, however, was the same moment Lord Stanley gave his men the order to join the battle on Henry Tudor's side. Richard and his men were immediately overwhelmed, not only by the quick reformation of Henry's infantry, but also by the cavalry charge led by Lord Thomas Stanley's brother, William. Richard was surrounded and his own troops were cut down around him. Brandishing his sword, he cried out that he would die a king on the battlefield. This is exactly what happened. Shortly afterwards, Richard III was knocked from his horse, impaled by an unknown Welsh pikeman, and was then viciously beaten to death by Henry's men. Lord Stanley, who had not fought at all during the battle, then rode across the field towards Henry, stopping to collect the crown from the mutilated body of Richard III, which he then placed on Henry's head. With victory at Bosworth Field, Henry Tudor became King Henry VII of England. The odds against Henry had seemed nearly insurmountable, but he had achieved what no one, except perhaps his mother, thought he would. He had won the throne of England. Many challenges lay ahead, though. He now had to establish and build a stable regime into a dynasty that would outlast him. This would be no easy task after decades of civil war in England, and from the vantage point of 1485, Henry must have assumed that a claimant to the throne would soon emerge to challenge him, much as Richard III, Edward V, Edward IV, and Henry VI had all been challenged since the 1450s. Thus, one of Henry's first actions was to imprison the 9-year-old Earl of Warwick, son of George, Duke of Clarence, a nephew of Edward IV, and the last known male Yorkist claimant to the throne. Henry also issued pardons and favours to his supporters. He conferred the high honour of the title My Lady the King's Mother on Margaret Beaufort, who did not fail thereafter to sign herself Margaret R, or Regina, even though she had never been crowned queen. Henry also rewarded his stepfather, Lord Thomas Stanley, Earl of Derby, and his brother, Lord William Stanley. The new king was crowned at Westminster Abbey on the 30th of October, 1485. Only a few days later, Henry VII held his first parliament. In the course of this, efforts were made to try to invalidate Richard III's 2-year reign and to legitimize Henry's own accession, with legal arguments put forward to indicate that Richard was a usurper, whereas Henry was the rightful claimant after Richard had killed his 2 nephews, the sons of Edward IV. The Parliament also overturned the decree issued by Richard's Parliament, which had declared the marriage between Edward IV and Elizabeth Woodville illegal and rendered their children illegitimate in the process. This legitimized Henry's future bride, Elizabeth of York, and ensured that any children he might have with her would be considered legitimate. Finally, Henry also undertook efforts at this time to rewrite the history of his fight for the throne. He backdated the Battle of Bosworth Field to the 21st of August 1485, when it had actually taken place on the 22nd of August. This was a minor change, but by pushing the date back by 1 day, Henry gave himself the ability to accuse anyone who had fought on Richard's side at Bosworth Field of treason. It was an early indication of the kind of ruthlessness which, over time, would engender much criticism of Henry VII. The move caused much disquiet and fear, yet at this early stage, this action by the new king was little more than a simple reminder that all were spared and made prosperous only by Henry's grace and favour. The tactic, though, would fail to ensure domestic peace in England, and Henry would face no less than 4 rebellions over the next 12 years. Henry VII delayed honouring his promise to marry Elizabeth of York until the following year. They eventually married on the 18th of January 1486. The reason for the delay is unclear, especially so when we consider that Elizabeth gave birth to their first child less than 7 months after their wedding, indicating that she was already pregnant when she was brought to the altar. This highly suggests that Henry had only made his final decision to marry Elizabeth when he learned she was pregnant and could be reasonably confident that a male heir would result from the union in order to secure the new Tudor dynasty. Despite this utilitarian initial approach to the marriage, Henry and Elizabeth's marriage developed over time into a partnership of genuine love and respect. It was not only Elizabeth's bloodline, but also her popularity with the Yorkist nobles and the English people, and her loving devotion to Henry and their children, which propped up Henry's rule. Their marriage is somewhat unique in the medieval and early modern history of England, as Henry VII is not believed to have ever taken a mistress during his marriage. The union eventually resulted in 7 children over 17 years, 4 of whom survived to a marriageable age. The next 24 years of Henry VII's reign were marked by rebellions, challenges to his rule by rival claimants to the throne, and various efforts on Henry's part to preserve and strengthen his hold on England. In April 1486, he put down a minor rebellion organised by some Yorkist supporters, the 2 remaining Stafford brothers, and the Viscount Lovell. Later that year, on the 19th of September, the houses of York and Lancaster were truly united with the birth of Prince Arthur Tudor at Winchester. The birth of a male heir promised the coming of a new age of peace in England, and Henry's decision to name his eldest son after the legendary King of Britain and Camelot was highly symbolic. Henry's mother-in-law, Elizabeth Woodville, was godmother to baby Arthur at his christening. Nevertheless, just a few months later, the Queen Dowager was stripped of her estates and sent into forced retirement at Bermondsey Abbey. It is unclear exactly why Henry VII would have treated his mother-in-law in such a way, but the cause likely lay with his own mother, Margaret Beaufort, who viewed Woodville as a rival at court and who resented having to defer to her as a former queen consort. It was all an indication of how precarious the supposed alignment between the Yorkists and Lancastrians under Henry's rule could be, and how petty self-interest could jeopardize all of Henry's work. A fresh and more worrying rebellion against Henry's rule commenced in 1487. That year, John de la Pole, the Yorkist Earl of Lincoln, revolted in support of a peasant boy named Lambert Simnel. Lincoln and his followers now claimed that this boy was actually the young Earl of Warwick, nephew of Edward IV, whom they intended to place on the throne. Simnel was clearly a stooge who had been selected because he bore a passing resemblance to Warwick, the latter of whom in reality was still imprisoned in the Tower of London. Despite this, the plotters around Simnel gathered a significant following in Ireland, which was partially controlled by the English crown. Simnel was crowned as King Edward VI of England in a makeshift ceremony in Christchurch Cathedral in Dublin. Despite these promising beginnings, when Simnel and his followers crossed to England, Henry quickly crushed their rebellion on the 16th of June 1487 at the Battle of Stoke, during which the Earl of Lincoln was killed. Afterwards, Henry showed mercy to the rebels, pardoning most of them, including Simnel, whom he brought to his court and employed in the kitchens there. He would live at least until the 1530s and later acquired a post as a royal falconer. Henry could be both ruthless and merciful as a monarch. In the same year, Henry commissioned a new royal crown to be made as a symbol of the new monarchy. This was studded with elaborate jewels and featured the royal symbols of both England and France, which the kings of England continued to press their claim to rule long after the 100 Years' War had ended. Other innovations of Henry's include the first minting of a gold sovereign or £1 coin. Other medieval coins typically featured an image of the monarch on one side and a cross on the other. Henry's gold sovereign, however, instead featured the Tudor rose. This combined the white and red roses of the houses of York and Lancaster and was a powerful statement to the realm that Henry had united the warring factions and ended the Civil War. He also invested heavily in architecture and ornamentation to bolster his rule, building the impressive Richmond Palace on the banks of the River Thames near London. This was built around 1500 and would remain one of the foremost royal residences in England for a century and a half before being largely destroyed at the time of the English Civil War in the middle of the 17th century. King Henry and Queen Elizabeth's family continued to grow throughout the first decade of their marriage. On the 28th of November 1489, Elizabeth gave birth to their second child and eldest daughter, whom they named Margaret after Henry's mother. 2 years later, on the 28th of June 1491, their second son, named Prince Henry after his father, was born. Their fourth child, another daughter, arrived in July 1492 and was named Elizabeth after her mother, but she only lived for 3 years at a time of high levels of infant mortality. 4 years after the ill-fated Elizabeth's birth, on the 18th of March 1496, Elizabeth was delivered of her last child to survive to adulthood, Mary. While Henry VII was widely known as a friendly but nonetheless sober, cautious and reserved personality, he thawed considerably with his wife and children and apparently encouraged and enjoyed his close family life. Back in the mid-1480s, King Louis XI of France and his successor Charles VIII had been allies of Henry Tudor. This amicable relationship with the French could only last so long, though. In 1491, the French invaded Brittany, Henry's former home and the seat of his closest allies during his exile. Henry responded by declaring war on France. Parliament was reluctant, however, to vote funding for this venture and made their grant conditional on a promise that the war would be of short duration. Henry was, therefore, delayed from setting sail for France until October, nearly the end of the campaigning season, and after only 3 weeks on campaign, the French offered Henry peace terms. Within weeks, Henry agreed to withdraw in exchange for an annual pension of £12,500 from the French king. It was a relatively shrewd move on Henry's part, yet for many Englishmen, who viewed war with France and the reimposition of England's claims to regions like Normandy as a point of English national honour, this was perceived as a cowardly move. In the 1490s, Henry had to deal with fresh unrest emanating again from Ireland as word reached England that a young man who had spent time there called Perkin Warbeck was claiming to be Richard of Shrewsbury, the younger son of King Edward IV. In reality, Warbeck was another impostor. His background is shrouded in legend, although most historians agree that he probably hailed from the Low Countries and had been plucked from obscurity there by the Countess of Burgundy, a sister of the deceased King Edward IV, on account of his resemblance to Richard. These claims were worrisome. Henry's kingship was predicated on the understanding that Edward IV's sons had been killed by Richard III, and that he had the strongest claim to the throne as a result. Moreover, unlike Lambert Simnel before him, Warbeck was at large for several years and acquired powerful allies in Scotland and on the continent, as well as in Ireland. He also was an active rebel, unlike the passive Simnel. In order to meet this challenge, as Warbeck prepared to invade England, new taxes were imposed by Henry in England. These, in turn, sparked outrage and rebellion in Cornwall, leading to a general rebellion across southern England in the summer of 1497. It was only suppressed following military clashes near London itself, and Henry's wife and children had to take refuge in the Tower of London for their safety at the height of the emergency. On the 17th of June 1497, Henry VII defeated the Cornish rebels at the Battle of Blackheath, also known as the Battle of Deptford Bridge. 4 months later, on the 5th of October, the man claiming to be Richard, Duke of York, Perkin Warbeck, was finally captured in Hampshire and imprisoned in the Tower of London. After extensive interrogation, he finally signed a full confession, stating that his claim to the throne of England had been fraudulent and that his real name was indeed Perkin Warbeck, while he was a common Flemish man from the town of Tournai in what is now Belgium. With this, Henry was able to broadcast to the realm that this man was not the returned son of Edward IV. After a failed attempt to escape from the Tower in November 1499, Warbeck was executed, bringing to an end a 4-year episode which ended up costing Henry over £13,000, an enormous sum in the late 15th century, and creating huge unrest across the kingdom at the same time. Following the Warbeck emergency, Henry began turning to more calculated ways of strengthening his grip on power, specifically by employing a cohort of ruthless administrators who would build up a secret service to monitor the political world of the English court and the towns, and also to engage in a more absolutist form of government, one which would extract as much money as possible from the country. Through these means, Henry would develop a more efficient method of ruling and secure the Tudor dynasty against all enemies. This was royal absolutism over a century before it first emerged in France. Henry relied on the political advice offered by the highly learned former Chief Justice Sir John Fortescue in the many books he had produced on England's politics prior to his death in 1479. He wrote a highly influential book on statecraft, often referred to simply as The Governance of England, but whose original title was The Difference Between an Absolute and a Limited Monarchy. Fortescue had spent his life observing the differences between English governance and that of France, and had concluded that the English king's inability to impose taxes without the consent of Parliament was the crucial difference between the monarchies of England and France. The French king could levy taxes on his people whenever he wanted, making him rich and powerful. The common people of England, on the other hand, were far more prosperous and had placed limits on the English crown's ability to raise taxes. This, Fortescue asserted, had been the primary cause of the ruinous Wars of the Roses. If Henry wanted to strengthen his position, he needed to overcome this difficulty and enrich himself in other ways. The solution, he believed, would be for the king to acquire new lands and annual revenues, and in doing so end the power which Parliament and the aristocracy held over him. Fortescue's assessment opened up a period of absolutist government in the last decade of Henry's reign. He heavily limited the court and drastically reduced the number of people who had access to the seat of power, in the process reducing the cost of government considerably and saving a lot of money. The offshoot of this was that Henry now began to rule with just a small cohort of loyal followers. Henry also strengthened his network of spies and began to acquire more lands and revenues by pressuring his nobles to sell their property to him wherever he could. His administrators took personal charge of England's finances, micromanaging the collection of taxes and other matters which traditionally had been left to local lords and elites to oversee. All of this was deeply resented by the political nation, yet there was also no denying that it was effective. During the last 12 years of his reign, the crown became financially self-sufficient, and between 1497 and 1509, Henry only had to convene one brief parliament in the spring of 1504. Another often overlooked element of Henry's policies during these years was his attitude towards Ireland. The English crown had conquered much of the neighbouring island in the 12th and 13th centuries, only to see an Irish resurgence push them back to Dublin and its hinterland in the 14th and 15th centuries. Moreover, not only was English rule there weakened, but the support both Simnel and Warbeck had acquired on the island demonstrated that even the lords of English blood in Ireland had become a liability to the English crown. Henry set about a more interventionist policy, sending Sir Edward Poynings to Ireland in 1494. Over the next several years, he introduced several major reforms and held a parliament, notably passing Poynings Law, a legal instrument which dictated that any legislation which was to be passed through an Irish parliament had to be reviewed by the government in England first. This would have constitutional implications for Ireland for the next 300 years. Henry also canvassed opinion on leading an army to Ireland to engage in a military conquest of the rebellious English lords and the native Irish lordships there, though in the end he decided this would be too costly and continued to allow the powerful Earls of Kildare to manage the Dublin government on his behalf. These years also saw Henry attempting to forge a powerful alliance with the two united kingdoms of Spain, Aragon and Castile, by marrying his eldest son and heir, Prince Arthur, to the Spanish princess Catherine of Aragon. On the 12th of November 1501, London crowds cheered as the 16-year-old Catherine passed through the city to the palace at Westminster. 2 days later, on the 14th of November, Arthur and Catherine were married at St. Paul's Cathedral in London, departing after a further 10 days of feasting, tournaments and entertainments for Ludlow Castle and their married life in the Welsh Marches. Having cemented such a prestigious marriage for his eldest son and heir, which had brought with it a very substantial dowry, Henry's legacy now seemed secure. However, less than 6 months later, disaster struck. In March 1502, Prince Arthur fell ill, possibly with the sweating sickness, a mysterious disease that regularly swept through Tudor England, the exact nature of which remains medically unclear to this day. On the 2nd of April, he died. Henry and Elizabeth were grief-stricken by Arthur's death. Henry's screams of anguish shocked members of the court who were not used to seeing their typically reserved monarch behave in this way. Arthur's funeral, while magnificent, was observed rather quietly at Worcester Cathedral, far from the crowded streets of London. The political fallout from the prince's death was immense. Prince Henry was now the only remaining male heir to the throne. To compound matters, less than a year later, Henry's wife died on her 37th birthday owing to a complicated pregnancy. The child that resulted from it, a girl named Catherine, lived less than 8 days. In under 12 months, Henry VII lost 2 children and his wife. The death of Elizabeth of York resulted in an outpouring of grief across the length and breadth of England. She had been well loved by the people, and her very presence had softened the hard edges of Henry's tendency towards autocratic rule. Her funeral procession and ceremony were among the grandest and most expensive events staged during the typically parsimonious Henry VII's reign, costing in excess of £3,000. Henry suffered an emotional collapse around this time. Despite a rocky and distrustful beginning, his marriage had become the rock of his reign, and the family he and Elizabeth had built together had softened the harsher edges of his personality. Following Elizabeth's death, Henry shut himself away for days, refusing to see or speak to anyone. When he finally emerged, many people noted that there was a harsher edge to him and he became harder and more autocratic in his ruling style. Despite his grief, Henry had to prepare for the succession anew. He took an especial interest in the education of his remaining son, Prince Henry. It was a difficult relationship. The king was a hard taskmaster, and his frequent criticism of Prince Henry might well have led to psychological issues which would, in turn, lead to the future King Henry VIII developing an extremely difficult personality himself, one which was a mix of overbearing brutality and thinly disguised narcissism. Also around this time, with a notable lack of emotion, Henry arranged the marriage of his 13-year-old daughter Margaret to King James IV of Scotland, a bare 6 months after his wife's death. The status of Princess Catherine of Aragon was also an issue. Following Arthur's death, the King and Queen of Spain had begun to demand the return of Princess Catherine's dowry, a very large sum of money which Henry desperately did not want to give back. After the death of his own wife, he considered marrying Catherine himself, but soon concluded that the most appropriate solution would be for Prince Henry to marry Catherine. To this end, he sought a papal dispensation for the betrothal of Catherine to Henry on the probably spurious basis that Catherine and Arthur had never consummated their marriage. The negotiations with Rome and with Catherine's parents in Spain would take many years, and in the end, Henry and Catherine would not marry until 1509, at which time there were still legal questions hanging over the marriage, ones which would be resurrected 20 years later with major consequences for English political and religious history. In the autumn of 1503, Henry recruited an experienced London lawyer named Edmund Dudley to assist him with his unscrupulous revenue-raising activities. Under Dudley's supervision, the Crown's fiscal policies became even more unpalatable. Not satisfied with simply pressuring landowners to sell their estates and give their annual revenues to him, Henry now enlisted Dudley to transform the Privy Chamber and the Royal Treasury, organs of traditional royal rule, into business operations. For instance, Dudley revived laws which had long been unenforced in England in order to impose fines on those who committed minor infractions. If anyone refused to pay the resulting fines or protested the injustice of them, they were imprisoned. Many, understandably, chose to pay the fines. Henry also began levying fines against his nobles for keeping private armies, despite the fact that this had always been the practice in medieval England, though this was a security measure too designed to ensure that no figure like Warwick the Kingmaker of decades gone by could foment new wars against the crown. Other legal interventions added to the growing animosity felt towards Henry VII and his closest advisers such as Fortescue and Dudley. For example, in the later years of his reign, Henry assembled a small group of hand-picked lawyers to serve as his, quote, counsel learned in the law. This body had no official power. Instead, it worked directly for Henry, intervening in various legal proceedings in the official courts and privately adjudicating on matters themselves. Often, this was done with the goal of imposing fines that were directly paid into the royal treasury. This caused enormous unrest, as such interventions were seen as a breach of the relationship between the English crown and its subjects, which had been established through various legal documents over several centuries, like the Magna Carta of the 13th century. In a sign of how reviled figures like Dudley were as instruments of Henry VII's absolutist policies, when Henry VIII ascended a few years later, Dudley was quickly arrested, charged with treason, and executed. By 1507, it was clear that the most popular person in England was Prince Henry. His father, the king, was glad to show off his son's abilities and tasked him with organising and staging the spring tournaments that year. The 15-year-old Henry literally shone during the ceremonies and events, presiding over the tournaments, greeting dignitaries, chatting with both noblemen and commoners with friendliness and charm, and graciously presenting the tournament's victors with expensive trinkets. Everyone present could see the glaringly clear distinction between the dour, serious and detached figure of Henry VII, who many people viewed as increasingly tyrannous, and the smiling, gregarious and open prince and heir. Not for nothing has one recent biographer of Henry VII referred to him as the Winter King during the 1500s, a figure who many people were effectively hoping would die soon. Prince Henry, the people believed, would be a different kind of ruler, one who thirsted for honour and glory rather than gold, who would extend privilege and favour to his nobles and his loyal subjects rather than suspicion and extortion. Henry VII had only turned 50 in January 1507. Still, the portraits painted of him in the mid-1500s show the ravages of his life and position. His high cheekbones, nose and cleft chin, which were always prominent, seemed to protrude even more. His increasingly thin, pale face, with deep lines in his forehead and down the sides of his nose, and the hollows beneath his seemingly cold blue eyes, told the story of a man whose early life had been full of promise, but whose constant companions in the years since had been anxiety, suspicion, disappointment, tragedy, illness, and grief. His health was also deteriorating, and he was suffering from what is presumed to have been tuberculosis. In January 1509, his condition worsened, and he withdrew from the court into seclusion at Richmond Palace. Finally, on the 21st of April 1509, Henry VII, King of England, died. He was just 52 years old at the time and had ruled England for 24 years. For 2 days his death was kept secret from everyone except those who had been present at his bedside, as plans were made to ensure a smooth succession without rebellion. Henry's council members were determined that there would be no new civil war, and all measures were taken to make sure that King Henry VIII was secure on the throne before proclamations were issued that the old king had died. By the time he died, Henry VII was much resented by the English public and the political nation of nobles, courtiers, local officials, and magistrates. He seemed to be little missed by most of the court, with the exception of his mother and some of his closest advisers. Margaret Beaufort had remained her son's closest and most trusted ally to the very end, and her love and support for her son had never wavered. It was Margaret who had scrambled to secure the accession of her grandson, Prince Henry, temporarily repressing her grief for her son until the succession was assured. It was she who organized her son's funeral and her grandson's coronation, even advising young King Henry VIII on selections for his Privy Council. Henry heeded her every recommendation, though she was not long for the world. The day after her grandson's 18th birthday, on the 29th of June 1509, less than 2 months after her own son's death, Margaret Beaufort followed Henry VII to the grave. Henry was buried next to his wife in the chapel he had built and adorned with his family's emblems in Westminster Abbey, their effigies lying in peaceful repose with their hands clasped in prayer. Margaret Beaufort was laid to rest in her own impressive tomb, only a few feet away from those of King Henry VII and Queen Elizabeth. The reign that followed began with great promise and descended into even greater instability than anything Henry VII had overseen. Henry VIII was not a figure intent on balancing the books and engaging in cautious policies. Instead, he became obsessed with resuming the war which King Edward III had begun back in the 1330s to reassert England's claims to lands in France. He went to war with the French on 3 occasions, effectively bankrupting the English state in the process and achieving virtually nothing other than securing the town of Boulogne in northern France for a few years before it was quickly lost again to the French. He is much more well known for his marital affairs. When his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, which was otherwise the happiest of his 6 marriages, failed to result in a male heir, he became determined to divorce her on the basis that his brother Arthur had consummated his marriage to Catherine after all back in 1501, and Henry could not legally marry his brother's bride as a result. The papacy and Spain were reluctant to agree with Henry's belated attack of fraternal conscience, setting in motion a chain of events which would see the Church of England split from the Roman Catholic fold and the Protestant Reformation commence in England. Henry would marry 5 more times in under a decade, with his 3rd marriage eventually producing a male heir, the future King Edward VI. Underlying all of this was an obsession with securing the succession. Henry was very much his father's son in this regard, and Henry VII's advice to his son to remember the civil wars of the 15th century coloured much of his actions decades later. Henry VII is often viewed as a somewhat tyrannical ruler. This is not entirely fair. While he did become an absolutist monarch of a kind in the 1500s and seemed to care less and less about how the English public and the political realm perceived his actions, those same actions were inherently logical and must be viewed in light of how he had come to the throne. Henry Tudor became King of England owing to a bizarre series of events in which psychologically unstable kings and murderous uncles had all conspired to allow a Welsh upstart, whose line was legally barred from inheriting the throne, to rise to become King Henry VII in 1485. Thereafter, he faced rebellion after rebellion in the late 1480s and throughout the 1490s. Eventually, having meditated on how he could secure the Tudor dynasty, he came to the conclusion that much of the Wars of the Roses had been driven by over-mighty nobles and a weak royal government that was perennially short of money. The way to avoid future civil wars was to weaken the nobility and strengthen the crown, above all, its treasury. And that is exactly what he set about doing with figures like Fortescue and Dudley in the 1500s. He might not have been well liked for proceeding in this way, but Henry VII brought the Wars of the Roses to an end and passed on a stronger government with a healthy balance sheet to his son. In many ways, he was the most successful of the Tudor monarchs, though he won little praise for it. What do you think of Henry VII? Was he an unnecessarily autocratic monarch, or were his actions understandable in light of the political crises which had gripped England for decades in the 15th century? Please, let us know in the comment section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.
Thank you for watching People Profiles Documentaries. Please subscribe if you haven't already. And don't forget to hit the bell icon to get notifications so you never miss an upload. If you would like to watch our videos with no adverts of any kind, listen to audio podcast versions of our videos, discuss history with other People Profiles fans, and much, much more, go to peopleprofiles.com and become a member for as little as $2 per month. Members can also receive discounted merchandise, behind-the-scenes material, and a credit in our videos, along with much more. So, please support us in our work in return for exclusive offers at peopleprofiles.com via the link in the video description. Thank you very much for watching.